Well, thanks for joining us today in the Storycraft Cafe. I am your host, Hank Garner, and today I am super excited to have Heather Webb on the show with me today. She's got a brand new book. It releases tomorrow, and it's called Strangers in the Night, a novel of Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner. What a captivating read this is, Heather. I thoroughly enjoyed it and can't wait for everyone to get their hands on it tomorrow. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was. They were quite a couple, Frank and Ava.
You can
And I got to tell you, when I was in the research phase, I could not look away. And I was trying to write the book that way, where you just cannot put it down because you have to know what crazy thing they're going to do next. Um,
Absolutely, and that's exactly how it reads. I love hearing that was the way the writing went because that 100% translates to the page.
well, it's great to hear.
Yeah. Um, look, before we dig into the book, let's get started with a fun question. Heather, is there writing is one of those things where you collect writing advice from people. A lot
Mhm.
of times, some of it is magnificent, and you just feel lucky that someone shared this little nugget of wisdom with you. And some of it, doesn't pan out exactly that way sometimes. Is there a piece of writing advice that you got from someone, and either you are eternally grateful that you got this advice and you treasure it, or it was so horrible you could not believe that someone shared that
Mm.
with you, or maybe you got one of each. But anyway, do you have a piece of writing advice that jumps out at you?
Yeah, I find that giving people a set of rules in a creative pursuit is ridiculous. I think it's a little infuriating. And it's not just that I'm a writer, I'm also a former high school teacher and a adjunct for an MFA in writing, creative writing program at Drexel University. And creativity is the name of the game, and everybody's going
Yeah.
to bring something different to the table. And I think some of the best writers play with style. They push different types of characters and structures. So I have to say that all of those rules, like no adverbs and don't use to be verbs, and some of these other rules that there it's a good rule of thumb in general as you're learning, but it's one of those things where I feel like the more seasoned you become as a writer, the more comfortable you are in your own creative skin, so to speak. You can start shedding those rules and finding your own way through your
Yeah.
writing.
It's so funny that you hear these rules that are, when you hear them, it's like they're set in stone. And then you start reading some of your favorite writers, and like, did they not read the same bit
They
rules
broke
that I
every
did?
one of those rules.
Right. Stephen King says never use adverbs, and
The road to hell is paved with adverbs.
yes, yes, and then Neil Gaiman never met an adverb that he didn't love. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously, there's a reason for that. And it's about
right,
using them well
right,
instead of overusing them. But I think a lot of people, especially aspiring writers, take those rules too literally,
yeah,
and can hamper your progress. So,
yeah. So Heather, what you said that you were a high school teacher
yes.
and also an adjunct professor.
Mhm.
Um, what was it that initially brought you around to writing?
So I was a high school teacher for about a decade, a little less,
Okay.
before I started writing. And I taught high school French, and I was a track coach. And I'm one of those rare individuals who actually really loves teenagers. Um, I love their sense of humor and the way that they're discovering sort of the deeper things in life. I find that really fascinating. Um, but when I got pregnant with my second, it was kind of one of those decisions where do we pay for childcare and go into debt so I can still teach, or do I stay home with him and go into debt?
Right.
So we decided I
The
was,
the dead
I
part was non-negotiable, wasn't it?
yeah, I just thought I want to be home with them, and it was just before I resigned actually that I started to have a dream about Josephine Bonaparte, which was the subject of my first novel. She kept coming to me every night for a couple of weeks, which was insane, I realized. And then I started reading biographies about her, and I was like, this woman, oh my God, she was fascinating. She went through all these things. Nobody really knows about her. And I started digging in. And next thing you know, I just turned to my husband one night and said, I have to write a book about her. And he was kind of like, what? So, and this was before I resigned. So I actually was feeling this call to write before. And, I had to do all the learning that everyone else has to do.
Right.
Um, and when I look back on my life, I was always a writer. I was copy editor of my high school paper and my college paper. I won a bunch of essay contests, but I had never thought that writing was something I should pursue. Even though I loved books, I carried them with me everywhere from age 4 and on.
Yeah.
So, and now here I am. It found me, even though I didn't know I needed it. It found me. So.
Well, as being someone that is a teacher, you can probably see the effect that you have on a young person who's, thinks, well, I've got this storytelling gene, but I don't really know what that means or how to be a writer. And you have the enviable position to help try to mold some of those paths. Was there ever a person in your life who gave you that motivation, that encouragement, that direction to help steer you? Can you isolate a person? Maybe it's a parent, maybe it's a teacher. Did you have someone
There's
like that in your
really a
life?
few at different parts of my life. I had when I did my first essay contest, believe it or not, it was high school. And one high school kid, is like, yay, I'm going to write for fun and enter this essay contest. That's how, when I look back, I laugh and go, hello, I was
Right.
always a writer. But
Yes.
I had an English teacher who would read my stuff and say, you really should enter this. This
Mm.
is really good. Let's talk about, XYZ. She was quite elderly at the time, so I'm sure she's no longer with us many years later. But she was definitely instrumental. My mom always pushed me too in English. She just said, my siblings, when they needed help, go ask Heather. She'll help you with your papers. Because she's very math oriented. So we were the opposites that way. There's just people along the way.
Yeah.
So
Aside from being visited by Miss Bonaparte, and writing is one of these things where we can talk like that this person starts speaking to you, or
it's
these
kind of
characters
magical.
that live in your head,
Yeah.
tell you what they're doing. That's the one career that I can think of where you can say stuff like that, and people, you know, they
We
just,
kind of go,
that's,
yeah, I know what you mean.
yeah, that's just Heather being Heather, whatever. Um, but aside from Miss Bonaparte coming to talk to you, what sparked your love of historical fiction? Because looking over your back catalog, that seems to be the niche that you have found for yourself. What is it about historical fiction that
Speaks
lights
to
your
me.
fire?
Well, originally I thought I was going to write young adult novels because, again, the high school thing, and I had
Right.
that teen voice in my head, and I've read a ton of young adult novels in many different categories, and I still enjoy them. But what's so funny is that historical fiction is what came out when I started writing.
Mm.
And I think, again, looking back, it was my dad. My dad loved old movies. He loved things like Ben Hur. We went to lots and lots of history museums. Any kind of historical site that you could go walk through and learn about. We were military, so we moved a lot. So every location we moved to, it's like, okay, where's the historical goodness in this town? Let's go find it. Let's learn about it. And it stuck with me. And again, it's one of those things where you don't really think about it. Then I go, hey, wait, I won the history award actually in 8th grade. And then again as a senior, you know, and then I did something completely different for 10 years. It had nothing to do with either one of those things. It's just really funny how, the signs are there when we're young, I think. And
Right. If you
kind of
just
obtusely,
right. If someone could tell you which clues to pay attention to in life, things. But I guess that's all part of adolescence,
Right? It
isn't
would
it?
make things a lot easier.
You're right, right. Speaking of historical fiction, what are some common misconceptions that you run into with people that maybe are not familiar with historical fiction? Like, what is historical fiction? What is not historical fiction?
This is an awesome question because I think people who are unaware of what it really means are turned off by it.
Yeah,
They think of dowdy old paintings, you know, they think of some of those really cheesy early films that were trying to portray events from the past that aren't any good.
right,
They think boring, they think dates, that it's a slog, that it's very dense. And that's just simply not true. Historical fiction is every other category too. It's mystery, it's romance, it's thriller, it's, there's historical fantasy. I mean, there's this huge range. It's just that these things take place in the past, and so this is one of the things I have to battle is, this is not boring and dry stuff. This is what the world is made of.
right.
So there's that. And the other thing is that because I'm a female and I have these female centric covers, I think sometimes I take a little heat from male readers about that. And it's funny that when men actually read my books, they go, "Oh, all right." Sometimes I have male characters as a point of view character. And even when I don't, the next ship home right behind me, it's a novel of Ellis Island, and it's there's just a lot of really interesting stuff. 1902, and they get absorbed in all the the historical layering that I put in the book and the characters themselves. So it's kind of twofold. It's like, okay, I'm a female. It's not bodice ripper stuff, even though it's got a female on the cover. And then the other thing is, it's not boring.
Right,
you
right.
know it's really it's just as good as any other category. It just depends on the way you write and what the story is.
Yeah.
So
Is it when you first begin to write historical fiction, is it difficult to find the boundaries? And I'll explain what I mean by that. When you're writing about Josephine Bonaparte, we're
mhm.
talking about a historical figure who we know, um, a certain amount about, depending on how much research you want to do. And then there's also a portion of this character that lives in sort of pop culture infamy. Like
Yes,
we have
yeah,
ideas about this character that may or may not be
just
true,
like
but they've
Frank
been
Sinatra and Strangers in the Night.
exact. Well,
Yeah.
but with Sinatra and Gardner, we're talking about people that are in recent memory.
Hmm.
They're gone now. They're no longer with us, but we may have some family members who remember them.
Hmm.
Um, so there's a closer connection to these historical figures as opposed to someone 200-300 years ago where we don't have an immediate connection to. Is it different writing about someone in the distant past versus someone in the near past?
It's very different. But where the way it's different really is the research itself. It's not different so much when you're talking about getting the details right.
Okay.
You have to, I write extensive historical outlines. I have giant stacks of books with pages tabulated and markers and things highlighted, etc. So that's very similar, though obviously a person that has lived somewhat recently, like Frank and Ava, there is a lot more that's documented because we had video, because we had TV and all these things. So it does mean there's a whole lot more. And that means there's a lot more to wade through. And it also means there's a lot more to get right. So that's definitely challenging compared to writing a character from 200-300 years ago. But in terms of an emotional arc, the real draw of a story, the part that the reader connects to and really loves, and is swept away by, it's still it's the same. You're stepping into someone's shoes, you're stepping into their hearts and their minds, and you're trying to connect in some way so that you can channel them to the page and portray them as accurately as you can, in a meaningful way. Not just, here's the facts and the situation, but this is what they were probably thinking or feeling. I think the human condition hasn't changed. So if you can really connect to the human condition on some level in these various situations these characters find themselves in, then that part is very much the same.
How do you decide where the fiction comes into historical fiction? Like, is there ever, and does the fiction ever veer off of the historical record, or is historical fiction there to fill in the parts that we don't have, yet still remain faithful to the parts we do have? Like, how do you
That's exactly
judge?
it. Yeah, at least for me, I think so. There's this kind of wide spectrum of historical fiction. You have some that it's mostly fictionalized, and there's not a lot of detail. The emphasis is really on the characters and the story, and it's set in the past, but there's just not a lot of sort of meat, so
Yeah.
to speak. It's more like a pie instead of a steak dinner. So there's that version, and then there's the really really heavily researched, loaded facts. And I think somewhere I'm definitely closer to the meaty end for sure
Okay.
in terms of doing the facts, but to answer your question, that's exactly what we do. We look for those gaps in the record, and we play. And this is also why Strangers in the Night was such a challenge, because there aren't that many gaps in the record.
Right.
So
Right.
I really had to work hard to very extensively research. It's definitely probably my most researched book. Although I kind of hit it hard with all of them because I like to know stuff. This is the other thing. I'm just
Yeah.
a nerd. I like to know stuff. I'm a teacher. I'm a learner. So, that's probably the most heavily researched book I've written, because there's just so many records of everything. And so where the fun came in with Strangers in the Night for me was the voice, getting the voices right,
Yep.
and the descriptions, and setting up these scenes, and making decisions about what to keep in and what to cut, and getting into the deeper themes. Like for Frank, I really believe that he had this sense of longing for legacy, this interest in legacy.
Mm.
Like, what comes after me? What does this all mean? I have all this talent, all these gifts. I've basically achieved every award there is to achieve, both in film
Right.
and music. What does all that mean? What am I leaving behind? And I think this is partially why he worked up until the very, very end, both not knowing who he was outside of that identity, and also wanting to perpetuate his legacy. And he certainly did. For Ava, it was a really different situation. She was a lot less concerned with that. For her, I think it was about having a good living and enjoying herself, and making things she was proud of, and certainly being successful at her work. But she did a whole lot of living between and after. So,
In if we're talking about biography or autobiography, we tend to think of those type stories as this big long arc, almost from birth to death, with
yes.
a full picture. And then if we're looking at memoir, we usually are looking at a window of a person's life. It's
Mhm.
a solitary event, or whatever, that we're kind of getting a glimpse at. And historical fiction serves kind of that purpose. I see that we're looking at a portion of this person or person's life, and this romance that we're specifically talking about here. But how do you determine the window that you're going to look through for this person's life when you take on a new project?
I look for an inflection point. What
Okay.
This is kind of how all fiction starts. What they call the inciting incident. Are you a writer yourself, Hank?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so you know what I'm talking about. So the inciting incident, for those who don't, it's this moment in a character's life at the very beginning of the book where everything in their life that they know of changes. Some major thing has just happened that's going to set them on this journey, and nothing will ever be the same again. So I actually look for that moment in a real person's life as well. What's the moment where they had a huge turning point and everything changed? Now, it's messy in a real person's life because there's many of those often. So you have to decide, what's the story I'm trying to tell? Am I focusing on, in this case, it's Frank and Ava, it's their relationship. If I was focusing on mostly their careers, which is definitely a secondary thread through the book, but it's not the main thing, then it would look really different than it does. But I knew that, when I was talking with my publisher, this is what they wanted. They wanted me to focus on their relationship and the tumult and how things came and went around this relationship. So I started with, when did they meet? How did they meet? And then I had to fast forward. That's the prologue. And I fast forward a few years to when they actually really start to come together, because they met before they actually really came together. And that's what the whole arc of the book is fashioned around. And it's, divided into 5 parts, like any good tragedy. And Greek tragedy, I should say. And yeah, then it goes from there.
How did these characters come into your life? Was this something that you've been fascinated by for a while, or what was it that piqued your interest?
I was actually approached by my publisher. They were working in conjunction with another company, another agency that's not my lit agency. And they're looking for a writer. And they said, this is the writer you want. And so when they approached me, it was kind of a right for hire situation, which is not always a great gig for an author, but I could not say no to Frank Sinatra. I grew up with Frank in the background of my life. My mom's family is Italian American from Chicago. I mean, there's no getting around Frank Sinatra in my life.
Yeah.
I mean, my grandfather played it every Sunday at we would always have a big meal on Sundays after Mass, and he would play Frank and all the other crooners, and pour whiskey and Jack Daniels, and we would, he was there. He was sort of omnipresent. Ava, I knew nothing about, honestly. I couldn't pick her out of a lineup of Hollywood starlets. It's, and looking at some of her pictures, and I know them so well now. I had seen them, but I didn't know who she was. She was a very impressive person as well.
Well, I would imagine, because, when someone finds out that you're a writer, you get kind of stories pitched at you all the time, whether people mean to or not. They're like, "Hey, have you ever heard, about this story?" And some of them are interesting. Sometimes they're fascinating, but not always are they the kind of ideas that just sort of haunt your brain and like, oh, I really need to dig into this. What was it about these characters when your publisher kind of pitched this idea to you? Like you said, that it's not always a great fit for a writer, but sometimes it is. Like, obviously, this was a fantastic fit for you.
Yeah, it really was.
So, but what was it about this other than your connection to Frank growing up? Because, let's be honest, we all have connections to something in our past. It doesn't mean we want to spend a year of our life writing a book about it. What was it about this story, these characters, that really resonated with you?
There's a lot actually in the story of those two, both individually and as a couple. First of all, Hollywood sexism and ageism was unreal back then. It's still there, as we know. We see stories all the time.
Still is.
But it was a whole different level. It was an accepted thing. And, at 35, Ava was on a fast track to being retired. I mean, and it's still really difficult for women in their mid 30s and older to get roles unless they're really, really big names. But yeah, so that was really fascinating to me. And the studio culture, the film studio culture, I found really interesting. So all of those, I definitely knew I wanted to explore. And then I gotta say, I just love a good angsty love story. It's kind of I love a good tragedy. I like that, all that yearning and that spark. But man, the heartbreak with an angsty love story is hard to beat. And I like watching all the sparks fly and then see how things come out on the other side. And that's exactly what this story is. It's like, in some ways they were star-crossed lovers, and there's a lot that went on between them that was not so pretty. But they were still friends and always came back together over and over again until she died.
Wow.
So
You mentioned earlier the research that went into this book, and that goes into all of your books. What is your process like for gathering research and then kind of categorizing what is meant for the book, what is meant just for your brain, so that you have a background to paint from, if you will, if that analogy is not too much of
yeah,
a reach. How do you start organizing all of the stuff that you collect and figure out what is going in the book and what is usable and all of that good stuff?
I think that's another great question, because it can seem like this giant avalanche of information. So how do you
Yeah,
deal with it all? Um,
especially something so close at hand to our
mhm.
personal histories.
Yeah, I think that the trick is to organize as best as possible. And in my life, I wouldn't say I'm terribly orderly. I'm not a mess, but I'm not terribly orderly. I'm kind of somewhere in between. And I've had to learn how to be more orderly. Having been a teacher really helped me with that, because it's
Yeah.
like, oh my God, I'm keeping track of 130 kids' papers and tests and projects. I have to figure out a system. So the system for me is to always start with books. I always gather, if you're talking about biographical figures like Frank and Ava, I just bought an absolute ton of information, a ton of biographies about Frank, and there's several good ones about Ava as well. And then I also bought some books about Hollywood in the 50s and the 40s, the golden era of Hollywood studios. I just, so that gave me some good background. Um, and like I said, I make a historical outline of the information. And all I do with that, I mean, obviously you can't go through and write down everything you just read from those books, but I'll set up themes, like Frank's career highlights is a section on my historical outline, and I'll bullet several things with the date and other couple of important pieces of information, something like that. Um, and for Ava, awards, nominations, that kind of thing. There'll be a section, places she lived, how long she was there, things like that. And those are very big, broad, basic things. But in terms of themes, I'll organize it in chunks of themes too. So there's a ton that I do not write down. It just kind of goes into the pot, and it's like stewing around in your head. And I try to highlight in my outline some of the more important things to the book. Sometimes you're not sure, like you write it, and then you work on a synopsis, and then you start writing the book itself, and you realize, oh crap, I need a lot more about this particular area, because I know very little about this specific topic, and so then you have to
Right.
dig in again. So your research isn't really completely finished until you've turned in the book, but first couple of drafts in particular.
In looking over your website, before we did this interview, I realized that you're also an editor, and that you do consultation
Mhm.
with writers. There are I know a number of editors that are not writers, and they have a very valuable skill set. Some of them are top notch, much sought after editors. And then I also know a lot of writers, and we'll be talking over projects, and you get different feedback from them. Sometimes you'll get feedback like, this portion of the book is great, or this other portion kind of lags and readers are not going to like that. Like, you get different feedback from them. And then I have a couple of friends who are writers and editors, and you get um kind of the whole gamut of feedback. Not only are your writing mechanics lacking here, but readers will also really resonate with this.
Mhm.
So I guess what I'm asking is, if you could give someone advice on editing their book, and we're actually in the middle of a challenge where we've got a group of people that are rewriting a novel that we did the first draft back in the fall, and taking going deep on the rewriting process. What are some of the things that people could do better that you maybe see over and over again? Some pitfalls that people should be aware of.
I think what you were saying first, I would like to address that. I agree with you. I think what you're trying to say is there are some really brilliant editors who don't write books that are out there,
Yes.
and that is definitely true because they're critical readers,
Right.
and they do a tremendous job with feedback. But that's a small number, I think. I think you do often get much better, more in depth, comprehensive feedback from someone who writes and edits because I read as a reader, I read as an editor, and I read as a writer. And so I'm bringing three things to the table, and other people who are like me are bringing three avenues to the table, as long as they're readers. Unfortunately, believe it or not, I know a lot of writers who don't read, which I find kind of mind blowing. Um,
Yes.
I don't have time. I don't have
100%.
time. I'm like, you find ways to make time because it's your industry and it makes
Right.
your writing stronger. You learn constantly when you're reading other people's work. So I first I have to say that in terms of pitfalls, it's such a huge thing because it's a hard question to answer. It just depends on what level you're at. If you're very new in your writing career, or aspiring writer and you're still in the heavy duty learning craft phase, I think the best thing you can do is to get a draft or two down and then get eyes on it, get as many people to check it
Yeah.
out as possible, and learn to develop and trust your instincts because not all the feedback you get is helpful, and it's all subjective to some degree, but there is sort of a level of craft that should be reached before you can go to the next phase. And once you get to that phase, it's a whole other thing in terms of pitfalls. It's more like people usually need to spend more time digging into the emotional arcs of a character.
Right.
It's not about craft anymore. It's about psychology. It's about being a scientist of human behavior, which is what writers really are. Even in a plot-driven book, the stuff you remember most is the character that's driving the action.
Right.
So that would be my next piece of advice.
Scientist of human behavior. I'm going to quote you on that. That's amazing. I love it. The new book is called Strangers in the Night, and what an amazing book. I love this
Thank
book.
you.
And it's on sale tomorrow, Tuesday, March 21st. So no matter when you're hearing this, if you're hearing it on the 21st or after, you can run over to your bookstore and grab it. We'll also put links in the show notes where people can grab it from Amazon or Audible. Have you heard the audiobook of this yet,
You know
Heather?
what?
Or,
I haven't. I did hear the narrators, and I'm a big audiobook listener,
oh
and I
yeah, me
loved
too.
both of them. So I hope the male, I forget his name, Chris something. Sorry, I don't remember. Because I hadn't heard of him before, but I hope he nailed the Jersey. That's all I can say. I want a
Right.
little Jersey, a little New York. And Cassandra Campbell, who did Ava, is fantastic. I've
I've
heard
heard
her
her
in
before.
great
She is
books.
amazing.
Yes. So
Yeah. Well, fingers crossed. I know
yeah,
it's going to be amazing. Strangers in the Night, available everywhere tomorrow, or if you're hearing this tomorrow after, go grab it at your bookstore. Um, Heather, if people are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you're up to, the books in your back catalog, your editing services, where can they find you online and connect and do all that
pretty
good stuff?
much everywhere but TikTok. Not a TikTok girl, but Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I have a newsletter that goes out once a month, and I always include writerly tips and information about my editing, as well as lots of other stuff. So lots
And
of fun.
your website is heatherwebbauthor.com. Is that right?
HeatherWebbAuthor.com or HeatherWebb.net. Either one goes right to
Okay.
you'll find me.
Great. We'll link that up as well to make it easier for folks to find you. Heather, this has been an amazing chat. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you for having me.